Alps Matterhorn, which is 4,478 meters tall and almost symmetrical, in the Pennine Mountains, a pristine intermediate peak may be found near the borders of Switzerland and Italy. Its four unbelievably high faces soar above the nearby glaciers and almost perfectly line up with the compass's directions. The Matterhorn had not yet been scaled after the initial ascents of the majority of the other significant alpine peaks in the 19th century. Two competing teams, one Italian and one British, hoped to be the first to climb the fabled Matterhorn after this golden period of alpinism. Their tale is told here. So in this video, we are going to take a closer look at the tragic first ascent of the Matterhorn. Antoine de Ville accomplished the first technical climb of a mountain, Mount Aiguille in France, in 1492. The same year Christopher Columbus sailed out from Spain. This was not the first climb ever completed in the Alps, and it surely wasn't the first climb ever completed on Earth. For thousands of years, local mountain climbing had been practiced by indigenous civilizations throughout the globe. Yet this did signal a turning point for European climbing and technical climbing. Eventually, during the late 18th century, scientists started to focus on the mountains because of the information they could get about the atmosphere, weather, and glaciers from them. The once impossible heights gradually turned into a sport for mountaineers throughout Europe. At this point, competing to be the first person to summit each major mountain was a source of both individual and societal pride. The so-called golden period of alpinism, during which many of the main Alps peaks were first scaled, began with the climb of the Wetterhorn in 1854. British climbers and their Swiss and French guides dominated this decade. The vast British Empire had already devoured all the continents when it turned its focus to the unconquered mountain summits, which appeared like the ideal place to raise a flag. A guy by the name of Edward Whymper was one of these climbers. Edward was schooled as an artist from an early age after being born on April 27, 1840, to an artist and a wooden engraver. A London publisher hired him to go to the Alps in the summer of 1860 to draw and engrave the mountainous terrain. The fit 20-year-old came there for employment but immediately fell in love with climbing. One of his contracts at this period was a failed attempt to climb Mount Pelvoux, which at the time was believed to be the highest peak in the area. Edward reached the summit of Mont Pelvoux himself in 1861 and learned that it was capped by a nearby mountain. He went climbing that peak after making this discovery, which led to a series of trips and first descents. His mix of physical prowess and aesthetic talent contributed to the area's incomplete topography at the time. With over a dozen first ascents over the next several years, Edward would rank among the most accomplished mountaineers in the whole globe. One peak, however, eluded him again and again. 7 times between the years of 1861 and 1865, Edward tried to climb the Matterhorn with the aid of an Italian guide named Jean-Antoine Carrel. Each of these efforts failed, and over time, the two's friendship deteriorated. According to Edward, Jean-Antoine believed that the first climb should be undertaken by a local person. Despite trying a different path and using multiple guides, Edward's fixation with climbing the mountain would come to an end after 8 failed attempts. On this occasion, though, he climbed up a rock corridor on the east wall. The crew attempted to follow the northeast ridge to the summit after reaching a ridge by traversing the east face, but a major avalanche of rock and ice caused them to give up. Despite their previous differences, Edward retained Jean-Antoine again after that unsuccessful effort and scheduled his services as a guide until July 11, 1865. Their effort was postponed because of bad weather on July 10th. In a normal situation, Edward might have easily agreed to renew their engagement, but Jean-Antoine had other plans with the Italian Alpine Club. Jean-Antoine had maintained a secret that his plans were an attempt to climb the Matterhorn due to Edward's infatuation with the peak. In addition, practically all of the other knowledgeable guides in the region had joined their excursion, so not only was Jean-Antoine unavailable. For the sake of Italian pride, an all-Italian team would attempt to summit the final significant climb in the Alps. But despite their best attempts to keep it a secret, Edward still learned about the Italian team's attempt and was indignant. He had to stop someone else from being the first person to climb the Matterhorn because of his pride and fascination with the mountain. He carefully examined the mountain's routes to determine if there was still a chance for him to surpass Jean-Antoine's group in time for the summit. He finally made up his mind to ascend from the north side, starting from the hamlet of Zermatt, and he left to locate porters and a guide. By accident, Lord Francis Douglas, an English lord, was staying nearby. He was excited to conquer the Matterhorn and had been traversing the Alps. He wasn't only interested in trying, he also knew two struggling farmers, Peter Taugwalder Sr. and Peter Taugwalder Jr., who lived outside the hamlet of Zermatt and worked as guides to supplement their income. The four headed off for the hamlet of Zermatt, which would serve as their base camp for their attempt the following day after the two farmers consented to join them. On the evening of July 12th, they arrived at the Monte Rosa Hotel with plans to depart the following morning. They were enjoying supper when three additional people entered the Monte Rosa, which was an unexpected turn of events. It turned out to be English climber Charles Hudson and Michel Croce, his guide, who had previously traveled with Edwards and Douglas Hadow. Hudson was a superb athlete but a beginner in the mountains. He had only climbed one mountain up to this point, and this was just his first season in the Alps. The party planned to attempt the next day at about the same time as Edwards' squad and had just returned from scouting out the mountain. Thus, the matter was resolved. Despite being thrown together in a hurry, the crew would depart the next morning. An 8-person party departed the Monte Rosa Hotel around 5:30 a.m. on July 13th. Joseph, the other son of Peter Sr., would serve as a porter for the first ascent. They rescued some equipment that had been kept inside a little chapel on Schwartzy Lake at 8,400 feet or 2,560 meters when they arrived there at 8:30 a.m. They walked up a ridge after that until 11:30 a.m. when they arrived at the Matterhorn's base. They traveled around the east face of the mountain for approximately 30 minutes from the base before finding a descent location for their 11,000-foot bivouac, 3,353 meters. They would only have to climb 3,500 vertical feet, 1,067 meters, the next day as a result. To save time the next day, Michael and Peter Jr. went ahead and surveyed the route. They said the journey was considerably simpler than it seemed from above when they arrived back at their destination around 3 p.m. The crew was cautiously hopeful about their prospects of summiting and even about maybe outpacing the Italian team to the top, although not knowing where the Italian team was located. Both crews set off at the crack of dawn on the morning of the 14th, intending to reach the summit by early afternoon. When the rest began their ascent to the mountain, Joseph, Peter Sr.'s youngest son, descended back to Zermatt after finishing his duty as a porter. The day before, it had been reported that Edwards' crew had been pleasantly delighted to discover that the path was far simpler than it had seemed from the ground. The northeast ridge created a huge, naturally occurring stairway that was simple to ascend. It was so simple that for the bulk of the climb, they didn't even need to use a rope. And most of the time, when there were difficult passages, they could just move to the left or right to go past the obstruction. With just 2,000 feet more to go, they had already reached 12,800 feet by 6:20 a.m. After a 30-minute rest and meal break, they resumed their journey at 10 a.m. at 14,000 feet. They took a short break here, knowing that the next part would provide a task more difficult than they had anticipated. They were slightly below what is known as the shoulder at this height. The mountain substantially gets more difficult and hazardous at this point. As the party notices this, they decide to rope up as an added measure of safety for the remainder of the climb. During mountain climbing, tethering is a standard technique. These mountains are so steep that if you fall, you can nearly never stop yourself because of how rapidly you gain speed. Someone else can brace himself and perhaps stop you from going down the mountain if you're at least tied to them. On the other hand, if two of them slide, this might lead to more than one person's death. 3 ropes had been carried over from Britain for their climb. One of them was a sash cord, which was thin and common at the time. The second item was a manila-made extra rope. The third was a brand new, specially designed rope that was created for the British Alpine Club for optimum safety in the mountains. The strength and flexibility of this rope made it less likely to break in the case of a fall. They were all roped together so that their combined weight, if one of them fell, would make it simpler to catch the guy. After then, the ascent became substantially more challenging, requiring constant help from the novice Douglas Hadow. Rock ridges were covered with snow, making footholds and handholds more elusive. Only 200 feet of snow, however, remained below the peak as they reached the top of the shoulder. As they neared the peak, the enthusiasm among the group became apparent. And after waiting for the opportunity for years, Edward lost all control. Edward disengaged from the rope and began running to the top because he was impatient and thought the Italians would arrive at any moment. Separating from the group, Michel immediately follows Edward. The two guys battled it out till the very end, neck and neck. On July 14, 1865, at 1:40 p.m., Edward Whymper and Michel Croz successfully climbed the Matterhorn. Unexpectedly, they discovered that there were no footprints anywhere on the summit, proving that they had not only reached the top, but had done so before the Italian crew. The height of alpinism was defined by this accomplishment, this last summit. The Italian squad was suddenly visible from Edward and Michel's vantage point 600 feet below. They screamed down to grab their attention, and when that didn't work, they even went so far as to toss some pebbles down. The Italians saw them and stopped dead in their tracks. The Italian squad turned around and began to descend the mountain after being devastated at not coming in first. Only a few minutes later, the remainder of the crew reached the peak, where they rested for an hour while celebrating their feat. They eventually hooked up again and began their fall down after deciding that they had fully enjoyed the situation. Yet they were aware that this would not be a simple fall. Given that Michel was the most experienced climber, they had him go first for this reason. Douglas, the least experienced, would come next. Douglas may need Michel's assistance to lead the way down. Charles would follow Douglas, followed by Francis, Peter Sr., Edward, and finally Peter Jr. When you heard that all 7 guys had been tied up together on the ascent, you could have already had a moment of trepidation if you are acquainted with alpine climbing. For several reasons, it is not recommended in contemporary alpine climbing to have so many people on a single rope. Secondly, teams tend to move more slowly the more individuals there are on a rope. That limits the team's movement and makes climbing more challenging. Slowing down makes you chilly and stiff, which makes the climb much more challenging. Finally, although you may assume that tying everyone up would promote safety, the reverse is true. When there are so many climbers on one rope, a fall may bring the whole group down. Douglas had already needed a lot of assistance going up. The descent was considerably more difficult due to the slick ice and snow, particularly without the aid of contemporary spikes and crampons. There came a time when Michel was controlling Douglas's every move. Michel put his axe down on one especially steep slope so that he could manually set Douglas's feet. Turned to take a step down when Douglas slipped and fell straight onto his back once they had found the right position. The two of them shot down the mountain without giving themselves any time to brace. Francis was the next to be yanked from his position, followed by Charles. Peter Sr. and Edward were able to brace themselves with just enough time between each person falling. Peter Sr. immediately made a U-turn and cinched his rope around a rock protrusion. The rope broke between Peter Sr. and Francis just as it started to become tight. They saw for the next 2 or 3 seconds as the 4 guys hurtled down the mountain while frantically reaching out to grab hold of everything they could. They eventually went over a cliff and vanished completely from view. It was difficult to save them as soon as the rope snapped. Peter Sr., Edward, and Peter Jr. froze in shock as they watched. The 2 guys were trembling and sobbing, and the whole group was stunned for 30 minutes, according to a subsequent account by Edward. Finally, after gathering their thoughts, they set out once again, securing themselves to some rocks before descending. They stopped on a secure crest at about 6:30 p.m. and made a call to the mountain, expecting to get a response, but all went in vain. They carried on until 9:30 p.m. when they camped out. The guys didn't exchange a single word that evening. On Saturday, July 15th, at first light, the 3 men began to descend the mountain once again. The Italian team had previously announced that the guys had reached the top, but they were not informed of the catastrophe. The group was originally applauded for their success, but as soon as it became apparent that only half the crew was returning, the atmosphere swiftly altered. The corpses were located when a search was organized, but it would take another 4 days to find what remained of them. The force and speed of the remains' journey down the mountain caused them to shatter apart, leaving only fragments for the search crew to retrieve. Moreover, one of Lord Francis Douglas's sleeves was the sole item ever discovered with his remains. His remaining body parts were never found. Edward began to accuse Peter Sr. of making errors while the hunt was ongoing. When Edward demanded to examine the rope, he discovered that it was the oldest and thinnest of all the ropes that Peter Sr. and Lord Francis had knotted together. The fact that 4 Brits had died and this was the first significant climbing tragedy at the time made things worse. Even the English Queen was connected to Lord Francis. The event received a lot of news coverage, and even the Queen remarked on it, even made it known that she considered outlawing climbing for British nationals. On July 21st, a meeting was organized at the Zermatt Hotel to investigate what had occurred. Was there any special negligence? Was there wrongdoing? Or was this just a coincidence? The Inquisition asked Edward, who was the first to be interrogated, to describe what happened on July 14th, starting when the party was just below the top. He continued by saying that the weak rope had been put in between the two groups, and even went so far as to accuse Peter Sr. of doing so to prevent him and his son from falling with the other group in the case of a collapse. The next person phoned was Peter Sr. He was in a bad situation since he was a mountain guide. If a guide is shown to have been irresponsible after an accident, and that carelessness results in 1 or more deaths, the guide may get a jail term. Luckily, Peter Sr. would go on to thoroughly address each question the Inquisition had. First of all, Peter Sr. maintained that the company needed more than 2 guides, even before the expedition ever began. Edward and Lord Francis reassured him nonetheless that their degree of expertise made them equivalent to a guide in terms of rank. Moreover, the weaker rope had only been chosen because no alternative rope was available. The manila rope was in Michel's rucksack, but the new rope was not long enough to secure all 7 guys. Yet although this rope was thought to be weaker, it was still thought to be strong enough to hold. They wouldn't have brought it at all if that were the case. The visitors, not the guides, supplied the ropes, which is maybe the most important point. The Brits were substantially better at constructing ropes due to their maritime knowledge, so efforts utilized the ropes they had brought with them. Now able to demonstrate the burns and wounds on his hands, Peter Sr. could show them. His rapid response to secure the higher 3 guys by wrapping the rope around a nearby rock when he heard the men fall and saved them from being dragged down as well. In the end, the investigation determined that the incident was only an accident caused by Douglas Hadow's rookie error. Peter Sr. was revered as a hero by Zermatt, but Edwards disagreed. He later wrote a book about the event in which he charged Peter Sr. with intentionally utilizing the thin cord. Because of the response to the deaths of the 4 men, he would additionally charge him with being mentally ill. The reputation of Peter Sr. was greatly harmed by this, and he had almost no options. Peters was probably uneducated, whereas Edward was a skilled writer. These claims made it difficult for Peter Sr. to go on as a guide following the occurrence. He would ultimately go to the U.S. to find a new job, but 4 years later he came back and acquired a stake in the Zermatt Hotel. Even though Peter Sr. had been declared innocent by the investigation, one issue remained that was discussed for many years after the disaster. Why couldn't all 7 guys be bound together with the unique rope? Not only was it too short, but it also seemed to have been sliced in half. It was believed that someone may have cut the rope during the fall to save the other 3 guys from being hauled down. And in reality, a sophisticated forensic analysis recently retained the rope and examined it. Amazingly, the way the fibers at the end were broken proves without a doubt that the rope was cut. This cast doubt on the group's whole account of what happened that day until a new finding was uncovered that clearly explained what had happened. A grandson of Douglas Hadow discovered several letters sent by Edward in the past 20 years in which he asserts that he cut the rope himself. He then seemed to recognize that the reason the particular rope was too short was due to his frustration while climbing and his decision to cut the rope into 2 shorter parts rather than untying himself. They had to use another rope to join the 2 parts since none of these ropes were long enough to bind all 7 guys together on the trip down. Yet despite this insight, it seems that Edward still didn't like Peter Sr., allowing the allegations to continue to fly out of control. Sadly, Peter Sr.'s image outside of Zermatt had already been seriously tarnished during his lifetime. But the most recent information clears his name once and for all, so maybe history will remember him positively. Peter Sr. would continue in his father's footsteps as a guide after the incident and go on to become one of the most well-known and highly regarded guides in the region. He would eventually reach the iconic peak 125 times and earn the endearing moniker Matterhorn Peter. Well, thanks for watching if you have made it this far. If you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already, consider becoming a subscriber to make sure you don't miss any of our next releases. Thanks for watching.